We're here to make a new type of news.
New insights and new styles and new topics every day.
We are News Generation.
Making news just for you. It's June 22nd here in Seoul. I'm Shin-Yoon, and this is News Generation, where we make the news at Arirang's very own open studio. Every morning, we'll discuss the top issues and latest current affairs affecting people in their 20s and 30s. Joining me in the studio is Cheska Dainham.
Happy Thursday, everyone!
Happy Thursday! Woo! And Walter Lee.
Lovely to be here.
Now, both are here to speak on behalf of people in their 20s and 30s. As usual, let's start with our news feed, which covers different hashtags and news items that have been trending on social media over the past 24 hours. A report from a Kathmandu-based Center for Integrated Mountain Development warned that glaciers in the Himalayan mountain ranges may lose up to 80% of their volume within this century. Climate change is posing a major problem. Last year, Europe saw new highs in sea surface levels, along with temperatures warming twice as much as the global average since the 1980s. Moving on to our second story. President Yoon Suk-yeol and First Lady Kim Gun-hee have wrapped up their visit to France, attending the General Assembly of the BIE to support Busan's bid to host the 2030 World Expo. During their visit, South Korea's First Lady met up with France's First Lady and discussed how K-pop and K-culture can strengthen cooperation. Kim Gun-hee specifically mentioned Blackpink's appearance at a gala concert in France and noted how memorable it was to see Parisian K-pop fans. And lastly, over the past few days, you may have seen the Titanic hit the headlines. 5 people have gone missing on a submersible on Sunday in a quest to explore where the Titanic sunk back in 1912. There's been a desperate search to find the vessel, and those on board are predicted to only have enough oxygen to last until around midday Thursday. Officials on Tuesday said their sonar did pick up banging sounds, but they couldn't identify whether this was recently heard and for how long. And we're going to take a closer look at the third news item. OceanGate CEO and founder Stockton Rush is among the 5 on board. There's also a British businessman, Pakistani billionaire and his son, and a French diver. And these 5 have gone aboard the submersible named Titan to find the Titanic 4,000 meters under the North Atlantic. And some people who heard this news said it's partly on these high-profile passengers who voluntarily paid to go on this dangerous mission. Others shared their hope for the team to be rescued. Now, I would like to ask our panelists here in the studio what they think, starting with Walter.
Of course, I've been keeping a close eye on the news as well and the progress of the story, and sadly what I've been hearing is not great news.
Yeah.
There hasn't been any positive news to come out of this. I mean, like, I took a look at the submarine and it looks quite, I would say, flimsy compared to a lot of the other submarines that we've seen that actually go down there. Some of the interior functionalities as well are store-bought, which I think is just very strange for someone who's paying billions or millions of dollars to go underwater in this very dangerous place. But yes, time is really running out. By the time this episode finishes, or even probably during, there's probably going to be some updates. Here in Korea, at least, we should know I don't know if it's a good result or a bad result by 7 p.m. because that's when the oxygen is due to run out. But many experts are basically saying they need a miracle.
Yeah, they need a miracle, and we're all hoping for one. But let's look at another angle to this story, which includes extreme tourism. As I mentioned, a lot of people who saw this news mentioned, why would someone pay billions and billions of dollars just to go to such a dangerous place? Like, what's behind the appeal of extreme tourism?
Yes, and before we mention that, I'm truly devastated as well, and I do hope they get rescued. But you mentioned a very good and interesting point. This isn't the first time many people have gone to extreme to sort of heighten up their lives or to get this crazy adrenaline rush on extreme adventures. And Walter, you mentioned briefly before we started this conversation that more astronauts have been to space than people have been down for research purposes to look for Titanic. That's how dangerous this mission was, and I'm sure people went knowing it. But probably it was the danger and the risks that drove them to this extreme. So this actually highlights, and as people commented, how far some rich people would go to get extreme things out of their lives.
And as we said, we are all hoping for a miracle here in the studio. And that was our news feed for this Thursday. Let's move on to our main discussion topic of the day. It's a question we've been asking for years. Should we abolish the death penalty? Take a look at the screen to find out where South Korea stands on this issue. South Korea has the death penalty, but the country hasn't executed anyone since 1997. Earlier this month, officials have decided to remove the sunset clause for the death penalty. The sunset clause required those who get the death penalty to be executed within 30 years of their final sentencing. Removing this clause aligns with the growing number of human rights activists and groups claiming that the death penalty goes against international order to respecting fundamental human rights. Today, NewsGen aims to answer 3 questions. 1. Where do most South Koreans, specifically millennials, Gen Z, stand on the death penalty debate? 2. Compared to other parts of the world, many seem to be for the death penalty in Korea. What are the main reasons behind this? 3. How does this differ from other parts of the world? We're going to be talking about a contentious issue, the death penalty. Should we keep it or eradicate it? Before I ask this question to our panelists in the studio, Cheska, why don't you first explain to us what South Korea's death penalty laws are like right now?
Absolutely, sure. So we're the only 4 OECD countries that actually practice the death penalty, including the United States, China, and Japan. However, since 1998, South Korea has practically imposed a de facto moratorium on executions, meaning since our last execution in 1997, we haven't had any. So instead, we grant presidential pardon or life imprisonment. And as of today, we have about 59 prisoners on death row. But the debate on whether we should keep it, since we have suspended it for so long, has been ongoing since.
Yeah, and as we just saw in our video just now, the Justice Ministry did give the green light to get rid of the so-called sunset clause, which many have interpreted as practically getting rid of the death penalty and instead enforcing life sentences. Could you elaborate more on this, Walter?
Yeah, right. So, yes, and you're right. The sunset clause doesn't actually mean it's the abolishment of the death penalty. What the sunset clause actually means is that it gives government, lawmakers, as well as parliament, etc., time to reevaluate the actual merits of the crime and whether they apply to today's situation. Now, after a certain period of time, in this case, it was 30 years, and since the 30-year death penalty has expired, many thought that the offender would just go free, but this is not the case, and therefore it would probably be overturned to a life sentence.
But a lot of experts said they were happy to see some type of discussion actually happen about the death penalty, because here in Korea, it seems that not a lot of legal discussions were brought about for quite a long time. And now I would like to ask you guys a $1 million question. Where do we, millennials and Gen Z in Korea, stand on the death penalty debate, including yourself? I mean, when I talk with my friends after looking at societal issues, we always say, should we actually execute these hard prisoners who commit horrible, horrible, heinous crimes? What about you? Where do you stand on this issue?
You said $1 million question, and I think that name deserves it. It's this truly tough question because, it's about somebody else's life, and we have no say in it. But
exactly, yeah.
So I would first like to refer to a survey done by Real Meter to show how South Korean public actually thinks about it. So let's take a look at the screen for more specifics. Now, this vote is actually fairly even, half and half, with slightly more upper hand to yes on death penalty. And now the no also includes the capital punishment and abolishment of capital punishment as well. Now, this voting ratio was very similar across all age groups up to the 60s. So people thought we do need capital punishment, slightly more people. But now for the MZs, I think they're more vocal on having strict laws and regulations because, as we have seen, there have been a lot of judicial outcomes that were far too lenient that really caused an outcry from the general public, including myself. And Yeon, you actually delivered this on the news feed just yesterday. But Walter, you also know there was a round kick assailant
in
who also sexually assaulted this woman, who was only ended up given 20 years, and he had, hear this, 18 priors. So he had already been in and out of prison since juvenile court or whatever for 18 times, and even at this time he was only given 20 years. So how, as the general citizen, are we supposed to feel safe?
Yeah, we don't feel safe.
I don't. I personally don't.
And you know what? Whenever I'm with my friends, we always talk about this. South Korea does seem to have very slap on the wrist type of penalties. They don't seem to have very strong-headed approaches to penalizing their criminals, which is why a lot of people, as you mentioned, especially MZers, seem to be for the death penalty, saying that stronger the better.
Right.
But where do you stand on this issue?
Okay, so for instance, I studied criminology, so therefore I had to take it from my academic background as well as my personal view. So with many things, justice-related issues like this, it's just not as easy as stopping something, right? First, there is human error, of course. There have been a number of cases where people have been proven innocent after they've been executed, which is obviously horrible.
Absolutely.
And this is because of the development of DNA, this has proven like these cases were innocent. And you can't obviously take that back.
Yeah.
Now, the way I see it, I think the death penalty is the easy way out for some prisoners.
Yeah.
That's controversial. Some people, I think, would agree with me, though. But not all offenders want to die, so I guess they do want to continue living. But from a personal perspective, right? Like, if I was the victim in some sort of way, or someone hurt someone I truly loved, I'd want to see them rot in jail. I don't think that the death penalty, I think the death penalty might be too good for them. I want them to live the rest of their life with the thought of knowing that they will never get out.
Gotcha.
And therefore, they have to get on with their lives. However, they won't have the freedom and they won't have the luxury of what we enjoy and take for granted.
You think that'd be a better penalty and a consequence that would last with them for the rest of their lives?
Yeah, my personal reading.
Yeah,
yes.
and it's definitely, this is such a contentious issue, and because it has to do with your life we're talking about. And we're going to find out what our viewers abroad then think about this issue. Take a look at the screen to find out what 3 of them said. Doina Arhire said in Romania there is no death sentence. There is a saying though, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, yet this applied a long time ago. Even if someone commits a crime, it's judged and sentenced with years in prison. Now, FWG said, no, we don't have it in Uruguay. Uruguay doesn't have an official religion, but the most practiced one is Catholicism. And one of the commandments is, you shall not kill, so we do have life imprisonment instead. Hussein said about half of the U.S., including my state, have the death penalty. I'm against it because it's an easy way out for criminals. Walter, we have someone who agrees with you on that.
Yeah,
Or
yeah,
is
like
that
I
you?
said.
Or
Again, that was me trying to get my point across.
Okay, you have way too many ideas.
Yeah. So, like I said, for some people, I actually heard recently there was a offender who wished for the death penalty.
Yeah.
So that, I think, is just an easy way out for people who don't value life the way we all do. And it is an easy way out because the death, many people are scared of death because it's painful.
Right.
But the process that I hear that they go through to be executed is not painful. So it seems like the easiest way out.
But as Cheska mentioned earlier in our discussion, we're one of the only 4 countries in the OECD, that has the
actually
death
have
penalty, which shows that the global trend is getting rid of the death penalty. Could you elaborate on this a bit?
Yeah, so like it's not just we're one of 4 OECD countries, but about 2/3 of the world's countries are for abolishing the death penalty, and it does appear to be increasing due to human rights, of course. There are many cases, country by country, on reasons why citizens want to get rid of the death penalty, but as Canada, as an example, the crime rate has actually fallen by 42%, 26 years after the abolition of the death penalty, Now, is this a correlation or a causation? I'd have to look more into it, but yeah, it does seem to decrease the crime.
All right, and to find out more on that, why don't we include an expert to add a bit more depth into our discussion of the day? We're now going to hear from an assistant professor of law at the University of South Carolina. It's Professor Madeline K. Wisselchuk. Great to have you here, Professor.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, I'd like to ask you the first question. How's the death penalty being applied in the States?
So the United States retains the death penalty, and it's the only nation in the Americas that does for ordinary crimes. But we have a federal system, so states have different laws. So 24 states have the death penalty, 23 have abolished the death penalty, and 3 have moratorium that were put in place by the governor. That's Oregon, California, and Pennsylvania. And the death penalty in the United States continues to decline, and it remains very localized. So in 2022, we had 18 people executed in only 6 of the 50 states. And only 13 out of 50 states have executed someone in the past 10 years.
I see.
And you mentioned that some states have actually overturned or decided not to have capital punishment. Why is this, and how has this affected the crime rates in these specific states?
So states that don't use the death penalty anymore have done so for many different reasons. Some out of concern for the accuracy of the process. One of you had mentioned that there had been exonerations. Some people believe in the inhumanity and indignity of execution, the cost of such punishment, and actually botched executions and the torturousness of the actual death can also contribute. So the first state to abolish the death penalty in the United States did so a very long time ago in 1846 in Michigan. And Virginia, the first southern state to abolish the death penalty in the United States, did so in 2021. States that have abolished the death penalty actually have lower murder rates in the United States than states that have kept the death penalty. And there's actually no credible evidence that the death penalty deters crime. Along with long sentences, we know that long sentences don't deter crime. Much more deterring is the fact that one believes that they will actually get caught. And in the United States, the issue of race and poverty, as in the rest of the world, are very big issues in the death penalty. Black and Latina people are sentenced to death at disproportionate rates, especially if their victims are white, and that has led many people to oppose the death penalty. And of course, the folks on death row are almost always poor and have often had very poor legal representation.
I see.
Right. I know that that's a huge problem in the States, is poor legal representation, and especially for the people who might not be able to afford it and therefore obviously have a very weak representative, right? Yep. So, but here in Korea, many youth are for the death penalty. What's it like in the United States? Are you seeing the younger generations also be more or against?
So that's so interesting to me. Support for the death penalty in the US remains at all-time lows. And we also know that depending on how you ask the question, people respond very differently. So in the US, about 55% of Americans say they support the death penalty when asked outright, do you support it or not? A different study found about 46% of Americans support it. But in general, we think that a little over half of the population does. More detailed survey questions that address the death penalty in more detail often find that majorities oppose the use of the death penalty, though, once you take into account that the people who receive it have histories of abuse, of mental illness, of brain damage, intellectual disability, and many are veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder. And also, if you give people the option of life without parole in the alternative, about 60% of people choose that. In terms of how different groups of people in the US think about the penalty, age, race, and political party make people's views very different. So young people in the US are less supportive of the death penalty than older people. About 51% of 18 to 29-year-olds approve of the death penalty, compared with about 61% of Americans 55 and older.
I see. All right, thank you so much, Professor Wisselchuk. It was a pleasure to have you here on our show and hear from you today.
Thanks so much for having me. Take care.
Thank you.
You know, Professor Wisselchuk just gave us so much insight on this issue, a lot of information, but of the many points she made, which one captivated your attention the most, Cheska?
Actually, the fact that she said based on the question that you ask the surveyors, you might be able to get a different response. And it's interesting because in the States, she said the older age group actually were more pro to capital punishment, right? But based on the Real Meter survey that I looked at
In Korea,
actually the 30s had the highest rate of yes to capital punishment. So I think this actually raises the question of the younger generation in South Korea thinking that we probably need an update on the legal system.
For sure. And why do you think that those in their 30s here in Korea have such a proactive stance on the death penalty compared to those in the States?
Obviously, there's a lot of human rights movements these days and a lot more attention attention towards like a citizen's, right to do something. Everyone is looking for equality. I think there is some sort of link there. What is also surprising was that she also mentioned, which I talked about with Canada, was that there was a decrease in crime, but it's not a correlation between knowing that the death penalty is abolished as well as the decrease in crime. It's also a very similar statistic to saying that when CCTVs are installed in certain areas that crime decreases. That's also a myth, actually. It doesn't deter crime, it just stops people from maybe going that way.
I see. So there's no direct correlation there.
It doesn't seem so, no.
But I would rather live in a place where it has a lot of CCTVs.
You're living in one. It sounds great. There's so many
True.
CCTVs anywhere. Now, I would like to wrap up our discussion by asking you to your final thoughts based on our discussion and interview with the professor. Where do you stand on the death penalty issue now?
Well, so the question is, like, when I go from another personal perspective, is how much am I paying in my tax towards these people? They have committed heinous crimes, or even people who are just in there for minor crimes as well. We are paying a lot of our tax money towards keeping them alive, so to speak. Now, I did a little digging. I know that California spends roughly $90,000 to $103,000 annually to keep prisoners in prison.
Wow.
And the Nevada legislature found that the median cost in their state is $1.26 million annually for sentencing to execution.
Wow.
So that's a lot of taxpayers' money like going towards this.
So would you be for or against?
Personally, I'm still very much on the fence. Like I mentioned before, if I wanted, if I was victimized, I would want my prisoner to rot in hell. But yes, I'm still very much on the fence from the academic point of view and also the personal
Yeah, it's a very tricky question, but where do you stand, Jessica?
I mean, I would like to quote Professor today and say what decreases the crime and not necessarily the capital punishment, but how easily you're going to be caught. And I would also like to add the punishment that you'll be getting subsequent to your crimes. Now, as an MZ, I really want to say I don't particularly feel safe given how our judicial system is giving out punishments to the crimes that happening, the drunk driving, the sexual assaults, the recent assault that we've been talking about. So I think the most important thing is that our judicial system quickly catches up to what is happening in the society so that we truly feel safe as taxpayers to really live in the society.
That's a good point. We'll end off right there. And All Right will be here every day from 9:30 to 10 a.m. Korea time, bringing you more topics young people are talking about. Special thanks to Jessica Dainhong.
Pleasure's always mine, thank you.
And Walter Lee.
Lovely to be here.
And thank you everyone for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. We are
News Generation.
Generation.